Thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's so good to see some familiar faces and some new faces. I'm excited to introduce Dr. James Dyson. James is a retired anthroposophic physician and former consultative advisor to Kimberton Waldorf School, and currently a lecturer and psychospiritual psychologist. And tonight he'll be discussing some of the assumptions that are underlying education that encourages the development of inner freedom of judgment. And we'll be thinking about this in the context of evolutionary theory, and also in the context of the underlying intention to help children develop a coherent sense of self. So those are big topics, and that's a big frame. And as James knows, these are topics and thoughts that are near and dear to my heart and mind, and at the heart of really a lot of what we're thinking about and why we're doing what we're doing here at Kimberton Waldorf School, especially living in it at a time when there are many things that are happening in the world, and many things that children are exposed to, many sort of forces in our culture that are actually working against the establishment of a coherent sense of self. So my personal sense is that it's more important now than ever before for us as adults to be clear and to have some clarity about what's involved in encouraging that sort of freedom and that sort of coherence in children, and doing so in a context of human evolution. And that's why we invited James to be here tonight. So thank you, James, so much for being here. I'm so glad you're here, and it's been such a delight to spend some time with you. And now it's your turn, so help me welcome Dr. James Dyson.
Thank you so much, Brad. I've got to decide whether to go here or go here. How is it for you? Does this feel remote, or is it all right? We'll see how it goes. Maybe I'll wander around, but I'm also a bit conscious of the camera, and it perhaps makes more sense to try to stay put. Now, in case you haven't noticed already, I have to begin with an apology for my voice. It just hit me about 4 days ago. I flew over from Britain a week ago yesterday. I actually went to Denver, and I had 4 nights in Denver and then came here, which is very nice because it meant that coming back here was more or less overcoming the time zone problem. But I did develop this in Denver, and it's not anything that's made me feel ill, but it does influence my voice, as you will notice. And that's just how it is, and I'll have to cough sometimes, and I just hope I can keep going reasonably well, because I've got 5 lectures to give in the next few days. But I would have to say it was a particular great pleasure for me to come here again to this platform last November after something like 4 or 5 years gap. I'd sort of laid down the idea that I would come here again, and then from a different body of relationships I was invited back, and that's very special, because I did develop a very strong sense of connection to Kimberton School, Waldorf School. One word came to me just now when I was looking at how to perhaps make some connection with these 3 main themes. The 3 main themes being independent judgment, evolutionary theory, freedom of judgment, independent inner freedom of judgment, evolutionary theory, and a coherent sense of self. I don't know if it's obvious why I might have connected those 3 things, but the word that came to me was the word narrative. Because it occurs to me that in the nowadays world, so much that we imbibe about just about everything, whether it's biology and evolutionary theory itself, whether it's how the pyramids were built, whether it's what's going on politically behind the scenes, whether you name it, it doesn't matter, whether it's Charles Darwin's theory of the origin of species. What we're subjected to are narratives. And some of these narratives may have something to do with ourselves. We may have been instrumental or participatory in the creating of these narratives, but I wonder just how much is original. I just wonder how many of the narratives in whichever field we look at have been simply imbibed as narrative. And of course, this is inevitable. Cultures create their own narratives around their own lives, their own existences, their own beliefs. Sometimes these take on a more religious form in the past. Maybe they take on more of a scientific form in nowadays times. But one of the awful things that I've had to really face up to throughout my professional career, but never more than in the last 4 or 5 years, I suppose to be specific 4 years, is the extent to which what is sold by the name of science is narrative. And particularly during COVID time, when this thing was created called the science, and when it became obvious to anyone who looked beyond the tip of their nose that there was huge divergence within the scientific world about a seemingly simple fact, like, for instance, what is a virus? Well, we could talk for light years about what is a virus. We all think that viruses are facts. I'm not saying viruses don't exist, but I am saying that virus is a narrative. There is a narrative in the word virus. You know, if you had an exercise, say you were school kids, or say you were on a seminar, and I said, take the next 3 or 4 minutes, just write down your own narrative about the meaning of the word virus. There'd be a big overlap, but there'd be some difference. But your narrative would be an interpretation. It would depend upon, to a very large extent, what your associations with this word are. So for some of you, viruses might be bad things out there that cause infections that we need a strong immune system to overcome. And maybe there would be different bits of narrative added on to that, like maybe for some people, and we've got to be very grateful for modern medical science that it's invented things that can help us to overcome vaccines. You know, that could be an inherent narrative. And it could be, yes, polio was a virus, and diphtheria was a virus, and flu is a virus. And these are clearly all enemies of humanity, and diseases are bad things, and viruses are part of bad things because they're part of diseases. Therefore, it's part of the mission of science to help us to become less vulnerable to viruses. Now, how many narratives have got bunched together in that definition of a virus? How many assumptions are there? Massive numbers, absolutely massive. One could unpack the kind of conglomerate, if I can use the word, of assumptions that stick together, and they trigger something in us, more or less usually at an unconscious level, when we hear this one single word. For someone else, I might say virus, and they might go into a post-traumatic stress disorder because maybe their daughter had developed post-viral syndrome and, to cut a long story short, had been in bed ever since. And therefore the very concept of virus had huge emotional, personal narratives attached to it. Because narratives exist on cognitive level, on emotional level, and on, let's say, volitional level. Some narratives seem to have implicit implications for instant action. What this narrative A, means this needs to happen. Yes, so child disappears from school one day. Gate was left open by mistake. Main road. What do we do? Well, that's a little narrative, and it has huge ramifications. You know, what's the protocol to deal with something like that? And a huge network of sub-narratives is called into place. And you can go on looking at similar things. Virtually every single word that we use has a narrative, because words do not mean just one thing. They have associations, and every word is connected to something or other. So if you just take the word rose, for most of us that will be a lovely, that the narratives associated to rose will be very positive, because roses are nice things and they grow in our gardens and we cultivate them, and they're usually associated with warm weather and summer, and they've got lots of connotations, and they're on. You might think, oh yes, there was a rose on the birthday card that I sent to my grandmother for her 70th birthday, how lovely. Or I gave a rose to my wife for her Christmas present this year. Or, you know, the narratives, the use of a word is evocative. And there will be a there will be a common level of evocativeness, and there'll be a personal level of evocativeness. And for the occasional person, roses will actually not evoke that sort of thing. Who might, for instance, not want to give their wife a lovely rose for her birthday?
Rose farmer?
You could say, if just let's say it was a rose farmer that had genetically bred lots of roses that are not really right roses at all, and that have been grown with hormones and grafted onto rootstock that are not roses, and fed antibiotics in the soil and given stuff to keep them to preserve, which has altered their very nature and perfumed artificially. If that's part of his narrative, then it'll be very different. And similarly, if your wife just happens to be allergic to roses, then you wouldn't want to give her a rose, because if she hadn't told you and you did, you might be in for a horrible mess. You get me? And just about everything that we meet is stacked up on that way, is stacked up in that way. And the question is whether or not a process of education should be geared to helping people to accept narratives on any level you care to mention, or whether a process of education should be designed to help people to build their own narratives, make their own judgments, make their own discernments, and actually sometimes not just buy into the given narrative about whatever it is. And that's a pretty basic question for any educator. Is it one that's really brought forward in modern educational theory and practice? I'm inclined to think generally not. I think it probably was 50 years ago in mainstream. If I look back to my education, which was not a Steiner-Waldorf education at all, from the age of 4 through till whenever, I never had Waldorf, but you know, there were parts of my education that perhaps I'm still suffering from, but there was a lot of it that I really appreciated. And what I really appreciated in my high school was the insistence, particularly of the literature and history teachers, the humanities, that it was their job to help us to think, and that exams were about being able to show that you had come to your own conclusion and weren't just buying into what this historian or that historian had said. So the mission in we call it the sixth form, what do you call it? The tops, class 12, high school. The mission of high school was read beyond the textbook. Go to the source, from the age, certainly from 16 onwards, it was stressed. And many of our exams, state exams, took account of that. They didn't want you to give a standard narrative back at all. And you had to write essays. All exams were essays. There was no such thing as, I don't know, what do you call it now?
Multiple choice.
Multiple choice didn't exist. Ticking boxes didn't exist. Computers didn't exist. You had to go to the raw material. Now, the problem with the computer age and the problem with the internet and the problem with all that is that the moment you look something up, you think you'll discover what it's meant to be. You imagine that you can find information about things. Well, indeed you can. And although I'm pretty slow on the uptake here, even I do it, and I'm a bit of a dinosaur here. But yes, I can appreciate just Googling something or somebody in a particular situation if I want to just just pad myself out a bit. But if I want to find something of who this person is, and I go to Wikipedia, well, I know I have to filter what I'm reading. I know that it's been put up there by somebody with their own narrative. It may be a very innocent narrative, and it may be a narrative that I would actually even subscribe to, but it may not be. And the problem is that nowadays times, facts and information have become separated from narratives, or to put it differently, facts have become so coloured by narratives that they're no longer a fact. They're a set of a million different assumptions, all of which are contained within a given concept. Now, the same thing, go back to virus, yes? It isn't even, if you talk about do viruses exist, you come across highly reputable people who say they don't. Now, what do I know about how many viruses really have been identified, say through electron microscopy, which is the only way you can identify them? So you're not even looking at them through your eyes, they're sort of inference 3 times removed. What is identified in electron microscopy are strands of either DNA or RNA. Now, if I said to you DNA, you wouldn't immediately think virus. You'd think, gosh, yeah, that's got something to do with the human genetic material, and you'd get a whole spectrum of different associations to do with DNA, which could include the evolutionary theory of human beings and the world, and a lot of other things besides. The origin of life, the nature of what's going on with DNA, why is DNA the origin of life? And then you might then look at another treatise on viruses, and you might see that people say, well, actually, the oldest form of life are viruses. And then suddenly you begin to realize that the concept of virus and the concept of DNA are not as far apart as you might have previously thought. And then you suddenly learn that the genetic material embedded in DNA is not fixed or stuck as people in certainly the 19th century, but right up to the time I was studying genetics, is not a fixed and stuck and given thing like previous generations had assumed. But DNA is in a continual process of exchange via RNA with the environment outside the cell, and that means that bits of the DNA are continually being excreted, replaced, shared with RNA, sometimes excreted by the cell. And you might then suddenly start thinking, well, are all viruses excreted from cells? Is that where they come from? And suddenly the concept of virus may become, my goodness me, that was once upon a time part of me. And then you might say, hang on a minute, could that mean that if I confront my immune system with a particular virus, I am reminding myself of a message that was once part of me that I now need to reintegrate into myself, because I excreted it, but I lost something in the process, and I now need to re-establish it. And suddenly, your concept of what immunity is about will completely change. And suddenly, you begin to see that a word, any word contains almost an infinite number of narratives which are attached to it either collectively or individually, either through the culture that we live in or through our own constitution or through personal experience. So, is divorce a bad thing? Well, one person might say divorce is a terrible thing because my divorce put me through hell and I really suffered under it and it should never have happened. And another person might say, my divorce was the best thing that ever happened to me and we've never been happier ever since. So every word has within it something that one might call a projection. And it's a projection that comes from the deepest level of our unconscious right up through our emotional life to our cognitive life and to things that we learn at school or university, which we kind of may just assume is true because presumably if I do a degree in, I don't know, whatever it is, evolutionary biology, surely I'm not going to be taught rubbish all the time. So, and anyway, I need to pass the exams. And anyway, there are so many facts to learn. I'll wait till later before I sort the narratives out because that's part of PhD. But then when you do a PhD, you can only find the very little bit of narrative that someone in power is interested in funding you with because it may have some use for the result of your PhD. So you're detracted from all your original questions and you spend your life trying to fulfill somebody else's narrative in order to get a PhD. And essentially, I'm sorry to say, this is the nature of what is called science. So what comes out the end of the tube is rather questionable and has very little to do with what most of us associate with the word science. What most of us associate with the word science is not an institute of enlightenment, is not everything that has been proven to be true in the case and is double-blind, trialed and peer-reviewed. It's not those things. Our definition of science is a possibility to explore meaning in as open-ended a way as possible and correlate an inner sense for truth and meaning with external evidence. But science is not only external evidence any more than it is only an inner sense of meaning. If we rely only on our own inner sense of meaning, we will be led astray. We are not sufficiently attuned to always know if it's right. We do need experimentation. We do need something that, quite legitimately is called the scientific method. But any scientist who is honest realizes and by any scientist, I don't mean any MD. I don't mean anyone with a PhD. I mean somebody who is devoted to a moral search for meaning. Someone who is devoted to figuring it out in a way that can be so coherent that that person can represent it through their own, a combination of their own inner conviction and something that's supported by evidence. That's what I mean by a scientist. They're few and far between. I guess 1 in 1,000 of people who might on paper qualify to be scientists are not scientists. And I wouldn't particularly even put myself forward there. I think if I qualify at all, it's by the grace of God rather than my own ability, because I haven't made that particular pursuit central to my life and work. When you go into the helping professions and you start helping people, you work from different parameters, not contradictory parameters, but different ones. But of course, the two sets of parameters converge, because if I'm working as an MD, and if I'm hoping to help people because people need medical doctors, well, it is important for me to take a view on whether in this case a particular treatment is appropriate or not, whether there is a place for a natural biological treatment, an alternative treatment or a complementary treatment, say for cancer, or whether this is a situation which needs surgery, radiotherapy and chemotherapy. All those questions involve discernment. And yes, you can say the majority of doctors in this case would recommend this. And we've now developed, as a result of that, something else, a new version of science. You know what the name of it is? It's called consensus science. That which is science is that which the majority of people are implicitly or explicitly consenting to as assumed truth. That's narrative. If you look at how many of those consensus science people could actually take a personal responsibility for the truth to which they are culturally, economically, and in other ways consensus, you'd find very, very, very few. And those few who stick their neck above the parapet tend to be marginalised by academia and tend not to get their articles peer-reviewed or published. So if this is the kind of world we want, what do we have to do to change it? The other question is this the kind of world in which people can ultimately feel happy? Because what is happiness based on? There is a level of happiness that is indeed based on a consensus narrative. There is. And I buy into that along with other people. It gives a certain sense of security. There is a certain comfort in being amongst people with whom you feel, yeah, I can say what I think's right and they will reflect it back to me. And when you find yourself in a bit of a polarized situation over something, it's uncomfortable. I'll never forget when I first went to France. I was 13. I went to stay with my pen friend, and a conversation arose at supper, and the net result of that was that I was taken away and given a lesson. And the lesson was, if you want to make friends, never talk about science, religion or politics. And there speaks a kind of tribalism. It means friends are based on sharing a common narrative, and if you've got a slightly different narrative from someone else, you lose friends. And losing friends isn't a good thing, because it means being excommunicated from your tribe or your family or your what have you, and then you'll be out on your own, and maybe no one will give you a job. So let's stay within the tribe. These forces have never been. These forces have always been powerful, but I think they're powerful nowadays on a global level more than ever before. So if we really talk about, the development of inner freedom of judgment, and what are the underlying assumptions on an education that encourages a development of an inner freedom of judgment, we're really addressing a very hot issue. Because there are implicit and explicit assumptions. I would have assumed 30 years ago that the phrase inner freedom of judgment would have been generally upheld within our culture. Well, I'm not sure if it would be now. I'm not at all sure if major trends in our current society would actually endorse that. I can't unpack that, but it is my impression that inner freedom of judgment is very, very threatening in very many circles. Science none the least. Now, if we just take a basic assumption about inner freedom of judgment, well, the word inner is already a loaded word. What does inner mean? Who's inner? What sort of inner? Inner? What does an inner freedom of judgment mean? What could it mean? Well, it'll have different narratives for each and every one of you. Inner. Inside. Well, do we have an inside? What is our inside? Is it our brain? Is that the real inside? Well, for some people, it is. If we think we have an inside, it's an illusion. We really just have a function of a brain. And brains aren't capable of inner judgment. They're only, even if they're 50 million times more advanced than the most advanced computer, they're nothing more nor less than instruments which can tune in to different algorithms, and something will come out the other end which you might think is something to do with an inner experience of judgment, but is the byproduct of your brain. Well, huge narratives inside all that. Huge narratives. And that's just because of the word inner. And what do I really mean by saying inner? I could mean what's in my intestines, that's inner, or what's in my liver, or what's in my kidney, as well as the brain. What do I mean by inner? Well, I think what I meant was subjective, as distinct from objective. Now, the moment you replace the word inner by subjective, there's a whole narrative there. Because is the subjective world of our consciousness, which can be our scientific consciousness, our emotional consciousness, our well-being consciousness. You know, do we enjoy this food? Are we hungry? Are we warm? Are we cold? All these very sentient levels of consciousness. These subjective experiences which span from what we might call knowledge to the deepest level of experience. What are they? Are they just an illusion? Are they a byproduct of the body? Or are they, and if they're not an illusion, then how on earth can you justify them? You see, in olden times, people wouldn't have said the brain had very much to do with consciousness at all. Even 500 years ago. I don't know if the brain, it probably did figure here and there, but it wasn't the dominant inner organ that people associated with consciousness. A friend of mine, I mentioned this because in the workshops that I'll be doing in Kimberton over the next days, we're looking at organs. And normally psychological workshops don't look at organs. Psychology doesn't think it has very much to do with livers, kidneys, lungs, hearts and spleens. If it has anything to do with any part of us, it would be brains. Or, if you're a little bit more sophisticated, endocrine glands and hormones. And if you're really sophisticated, maybe the microbiome, and maybe, if you're even more sophisticated, the microvirome. So we're back to viruses again, and consciousness. But generally speaking, nowadays, the neuropsychology is neuropsychology. There isn't hepatopsychology, there isn't rhinopsychology, there isn't pulmonopsychology. And here we are in our workshop studying what were regarded 500 years ago as the classical organs of consciousness. And one of my colleagues, because we're doing this, who's a dramatist, thought, I'm going to do what do you call it, a word search? Is that the thing? I'm going to do a search on how many times any of these organ names were mentioned in the entirety of Shakespeare's plays. And he's going to do a mini presentation on the conclusions. But I know, in my rather I've got something between a scanty and an expert knowledge of Shakespeare. I know a few plays well, but I'm not a scholar. But in my knowledge, I'm not sure if it was Hamlet's spleen or Hamlet's gall or Hamlet's liver or Hamlet's kidneys that were giving him problems. But usually for most of the key characters in Shakespeare, there's usually one phrase in one play indicating an organology that is characterologically specific. And that's because in Shakespeare's day, that's how people thought. So the concept of inner freedom then was very much connected with the organology of the body. And there was only one organ to which freedom was attributed. The heart. And the latest neuroscience and electromagnetic science and even substance science on the heart is beginning to elevate it beyond the level of brain on all levels. And I mean scientific evidence-based work. I don't mean sentimental hypotheses. So we're back to the concept of narrative, but we're also back to this question of the search for freedom of judgment. Is the subjective world anything more than the sum total of our organs, whether it's only the brain or everything else? Or might our organs be the instruments through which something that we might call truth may resonate? Resonance chambers. So, if I'm a musician, my violin is a resonance chamber. But it's been designed according to the laws of music. So the length of the fingerboard, the tension in the strings, the nature of the wood, the thickness of the wood, the sounding board, all these elements have been discovered over long periods of time by craftspeople who have gradually learnt to discover how to create an instrument that resonates to music. And this means that if you're a music instrument maker, even if you're producing musical instruments by mass production, the mass productive process has to have been programmed, and it's been programmed according to a lawfulness. And the lawfulness that programs the construction of the instrument has to resonate with the lawfulness of that which the instrument is meant to be serving, which is namely tone, interval, sound, music. There's a lawful resonance, and that resonance shows itself in the tone of the instrument. So a wind instrument resonates differently from a stringed instrument, and a high quality instrument has a pure resonance, and a low quality instrument will have a lot of aberrant frequencies which kind of shouldn't be there, like my voice right now. My larynx isn't resonating very well because it's messed up at the moment with inflammation. And an instrument can be messed up with inflammation if there's a knot in the wood in the wrong place, or if it got wet because it was left out in the rain, or if it was heated up, or something went a bit funny. And a piano will lose its resonance the more it's played, but a violin will improve its resonance, or a stringed instrument, the more it's played. So the way that an instrument is played will change its resonance. And if an instrument has been really played for a long time by a tremendously good musician who's come to love that instrument, then that musician will not necessarily readily offer it to someone else. And it's not only perhaps because it would cost $5 million if it was damaged, but it's because it's become part of themselves. They've invested themselves in that instrument, and they know if they were to pick up another instrument, it would take them another long period of time to really rebuild that relationship. But two things have to match in order that there's resonance. And the two big things, if I come to the point of evolutionary theory, what are the two big things that have to match up? I don't expect you to answer, but I'm asking myself and finding the best way of formulating it. But by all means, use your own inner judgment to figure out where I'm going. Is the evolving world that we see on this planet as it is, minerals, plants, animals, humans, and all the intermediate life forms and all that goes therewith, is this arbitrary dross that's come about as a result of thermodynamic processes, all of which are ultimately leading towards entropy? Entropy is disorder. And what, I don't know, is it the third law of thermodynamics? The second, which says the entropy of the universe is constantly increasing. I don't know if people actually still believe that. It may be still regarded as science, and it may be one of the narratives that's taught. Or it may have passed its sell-by date even as a mainstream narrative. Does anyone know?
It's still very widely regarded as objective truth.
So it's a narrative that it's been given the stamp of objective truth. So if we try and try that one on for size and say, how does that match into something like evolutionary theory? And how does inner evolutionary theory match into inner freedom of judgment? What do they have to do with each other? Because if we have subjective freedom of judgment, that's presumably evolved. Right? It wasn't always there, presumably. When we were sort of worms, and probably we don't even have it now, because it's probably only an illusion anyway. It's a byproduct of the brain. But even assuming this stupid idea that we might have it, well, it's obviously a higher stage of evolution. It's probably got something to do with the development of the prefrontal cortex of the brain. And if you're really sophisticated in modern evolutionary biology, you'll say, well, it's got something to do with the ability to do that. There are whole books on the hand describing how the morphology and the functionality of the hand has evolved, and how that ability has probably had more to do with creating the necessary configuration of the brain that will give us a capacity for subjective judgment than anything else. Really? None of the higher primates can do that. The thumb is just functioning like a finger. It took, according to modern evolutionary theory, billions of years for higher, I don't know if it's billions, tens of millions of years, maybe between tens and hundreds of millions of years, for a higher primate to evolve like that. And the only one that did is the human primate. And that would seem, by, let's just say, some of the modern experts in evolutionary theory, to indicate the development of the highest cognitive function. And I'm inclined to think it's true, because if you really meditate on what that means, you just think, well, it's any old movement. Is it any different from that? Well, actually, it is rather. It has a functional and a qualitative character which is exceedingly different. There are conferences that exist in the world that have nothing more, that concentrate just on the relevance of that in evolution. I can't go any further down that rabbit hole. The point of this rabbit hole was simply to illustrate that the moment you postulate that something like subjective freedom or inner freedom of judgment is a possibility, you're immediately led to the question, how did it evolve? And the moment you're led to the question, how did it evolve, you're led to the question, what's your concept of evolution? And then you sort of try to figure that out, and you suddenly discover that the dominant narrative in evolution is that the entropy of the universe is continually increasing, but it just so happens that for a very short span of time on this particular planet, it just happened to take a different course. But that's just an aberration within the general rule, and we all know that one day our planetary system will collapse, our sun will, I don't know, implode, is it the word, like a star. We'll all be back to square one, we'll all be imploded, and where are we in all that? Well, we're nowhere. Now, we might find all these varying hypotheses along the way very interesting, but if we actually take that proposition into ourselves as the science, and if we don't have the capacity to even ask the question, might there be a different way of looking at this, then is there any moral reason to avoid suicide, to avoid euthanasia, to avoid species extermination, or anything else? There isn't. There's no moral reason, because actually morality is a subjective construct that maybe has arisen because people needed to get on with each other, so they invented moral codes, and that turned out to be to the advantage of the survival of the species. But don't imagine that there is truth. And the moment you say there's no truth, well, there's no experience of truth, then the experience of beauty becomes subjective. And beauty just becomes a hormonal, emotional response to something. And there's absolutely no basis for distinguishing goodness from badness. Therefore, evil doesn't exist in the world. Therefore, good doesn't exist in the world. And evolutionary theory has anyway told us that it's all about the survival of the fittest, and the origin of the species is adaptation based on survival. And that's clearly thoroughly proven science, because it goes back to Darwin, and everyone knows that Darwin was the real star of this. So where do I go? If I follow it through consequentially to the bitter end, the end won't even be bitter, it'll be sour. Most people don't follow it through to the bitter end. And one might say, thank God they don't. Most people are more concerned with getting breakfast on the table tomorrow morning or mowing their lawns. And that's fine. But the less we have to do in this world, the more we're forced back on questions of this kind. The more artificial intelligence replaces humanness within work, there won't be lawns that will need to be mowed anymore. I mean, we already have our lawns mowed by robotic machines. We already have our carpets vacuumed by robotic machines. We already have our airports cleaned by robotic machines, and the windows. And this is just the beginning of the replacement of the human. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't certain jobs that might not be useful to be replaced. That's not the point. But the point is that through mowing lawns, making breakfasts, doing things, one achieves a certain kind of well-being in one's body that enables one to say, let the philosophers figure out these questions. I'm actually doing fine. I enjoy my work. I feel good after a day's work. I enjoy good exercise. I wouldn't be without it. And that's also wonderful. But when you no longer have that as a fallback position anymore, you begin to wonder what it's all about, because you seek the same kind of well-being from other things. And nowadays that search tends to go into the internet, and it tends to go into the dark net, and it tends to assume forms which are, to most of us, we would experience as lacking morality. But there's no argument there to put up against whether it's moral or not, because anything goes in a universe that has no meaning. And this is, for me, the ultimate challenge of modern life, and this is, to me, the ultimate challenge for our young people. Because I would propose that there's no such thing as a coherent self, body, mind, and spirit, unless that coherence is an originally produced subjective experience that says, I belong here. And if I belong here, then I, in my belonging, have to be able to figure out what my belonging has to do with the world belonging, and is this just an arbitrary accident of thermodynamics? Am I an aberration of the second law of thermodynamics? Or might this whole business of evolution, whether it's the scientific notion of matter and energy and evolution and laws of thermodynamics and whatever their modern extensions are in sort of astrophysics theory, might all this actually be a narrative? Who put it there? Is this just an interpretation, or is this science? And just on a really tiny scale here, do you know what the title of Darwin's famous book was?
Origin of Species.
Origin of Species. He had to have his arm twisted to give it that title. Most people don't know that. He actually said, my theories have nothing at all to do with the origin of species. They have to do with how a given species can adapt and maintain itself in a changing environment. But it doesn't tell us how the whale got whaleness. And it turns out that he was a brilliant researcher. He did harvest a vast amount of fantastic evidence to support his theory of adaptation. And it's probably uncontestable. There's nothing wrong with the evidence. The problem is the interpretation, the spin that's put on it. And nobody knows the spin, because the spin is the narrative, and the narrative has become invested in the concept The Origin of Species, written by Charles Darwin, the brilliant scientist who is so good and so wonderful that we can't even... And as a result of that, anyone who questions it in evolutionary biology, evolutionary developmental theory, can't get a high academic position. And yet I know some of the very best academics in evolutionary theory who contest it. I have personal friends of them. One died about 10 years ago called Brian Goodwin. And he was a professor of evolutionary theory at Brighton University and then went on to be at the Open University. And he wrote a book called How the Leopard Got Its Spots. Do you see the point of the title? Not how does a leopard change its spots, or a leopard can't change its spots, but how did the spots get there in the first place? Are the spots in the leopard an adaptation, or are the spots something to do with something that has to do with being a leopard? Or is being a leopard just an abstraction? Or is there a being that one might call leopardness? Is there a being that we might call humanness? Is there a being that we might call animalness? Is there a being that we might call plantness? Is there a being that we might call mineralness? The word being is out of fashion. It's another one of these words that doesn't seem to do, it either doesn't do very much anymore, or it tends to press buttons like, well, you're surely not one of these people that believe in angels or believe in God. And it turns out, of course, that those scientists around Darwin had a sort of hidden agenda, and that was to oppose the creationists that were still so active within the Catholic and other denominations of the Christian Church at that time. And we have this problem now. We still have within our Christianity, particularly in America, a fundamental conflict between the evolutionists and the creationists. I think that's the word. And it has to do with whether at the origin of something, what is a being? If we say, all right, there is a being to do with being human, and we then, if we try to define what is a being, it's actually not easy. A being is something that exists, seemingly, but that exists somehow. Is it a being? Probably not, but it's paper and it was once in a plant, and maybe that plant had a being quality. I don't know. You usually find that most things in this inorganic world come from things that were organic, like this lectern, those chairs. I don't know if this is it's probably an artificial fibre carpet, but if it was a wool carpet, it had come from something that was organic. Without the organic world, there wouldn't be actually very much of us, because 90% of the entirety of what is and exists in the world comes through photosynthesis from grass. It's important to remember, which becomes also trees, which becomes coal, which becomes oil, which becomes other things. And one of Steiner's whole evolutionary, one of his sort of minor evolutionary theory propositions or hypotheses, he doesn't ask us to believe it, but he offers it us. He says, well, the entire Earth's crust was once a living being. So you say that to a modern geologist. I wonder how an informed geologist might respond to that. And how many informed geologists are there? Because geology is a set of narratives, largely based on carbon dating and assumptions embedded in the science of carbon dating, which are continually changing. And yet, this also comes, seeing as I've looked at the rabbit hole of carbon dating. Some friends of mine, maybe some here, I don't know, have just come back from an incredible tour of Egypt. And of course what you get in Egypt are the narratives of when were the pyramids built. And the general idea through a combination of the narrative is, well, maybe 8,000 or 10,000 BC if you're lucky, but most were probably later than that. And yet, if you actually look at some of the Egyptian, I don't know what you'd call them, archaeological, architectural and other artifacts, there's no congruence that they came from such a late time. They were probably very much earlier. They probably preceded what then became the Egyptian civilization. They were probably incorporated at a later stage. And you then look at the question of what's the narrative of the technology that got them there. And the more you look at the narrative of the technology, the less likely you are to believe that it was all done by modern engineering techniques. And then you start hitting a brick wall, because if it wasn't done by engineering techniques, what the blazes was it done by, and what are you evoking as a possible explanation? Surely not magic. And that's against science. So you see, these people around Darwin had a sort of an ulterior motive. They didn't want to go into the realm of anything to do with the supernatural or anything to do with the concept of divinity. They wanted a universe that could be understood and controlled by they themselves. And sadly, that's very pervasive nowadays of the science. It's actually become welded with economic corporations, and science becomes that which you can make money from, and not that which bears witness to truth. So what kind of world do we want to educate our children to be able to manage? And the final proposition that unless we can manage this world through an inner freedom of judgment, we will lose all coherent sense of self, body, mind and spirit. And if we lose that coherence, there isn't going to be much future for the human race, because there's no point. We've had exactly an hour.
Could you take some questions?
Of course. My voice sort of held out, didn't it? And I didn't cough too much, so that's great. Can we think the good? Can we think the truth? Can we think reality? I left open what is the definition of being. Well, being, I would say a being is something that's real. And then you have to say, well, what is real? One direction is to say reality has to do with will and intentionality. That's one direction that a whole school of philosophers have gone down. That was Schopenhauer's view in the 19th century, that everything derives from will, and that if this lectern derives from a tree, then the tree is an expression of the will of the being of the tree. And, Steiner indicated that the being of the tree didn't exist primarily on the plane of our external perception, but that there was a level in which the tree's being could become visible, and for Steiner it was visible, and he even claimed one could talk with this being. Now that's a narrative that is not very popular these days, but ultimately, unless we can talk with the Creator, let me start at a different point. The resonance business, the musical instrument, I probably didn't complete that thought. If an instrument is resonant to music, then the laws of music have to underlie the instrument. Otherwise, there's no resonance. if I have the capacity of a coherent sense of self, which can make meaning as an original deed of inner freedom of judgment, then that has to be the resonance of something else. I've been given it. It's an endowment. And then you have to look at evolution along the lines, do I see evidence that within the outer world there is the same laws prevail as I can find within myself? And I would say the whole of everything Steiner brought had to do with helping us to see how, in a differentiated way, how the laws of the outer world are mirrored in the laws of the human being, how the human being resonates with the outer world, right down to really small details. And that level of resonance even goes as far as informing the curriculum in a Waldorf school. So one can unpack everything that Steiner gave as educational theory through the lens of saying you have to bring to the child what resonates in the child's development at that particular age. So we might imagine that at the age of 3, there are certain things that don't yet resonate because the child's instrument has not yet evolved to that point of having that resonant capacity. And that means that we have to recognize where is the instrument of the child at that stage of development and what does generate true resonance. And the theory is, if it resonates right, the child will develop in accordance with the lawfulness that will best lead him to ultimately a coherent sense of self, otherwise known as coherence or resilience. So, to go into what might be considered more philosophical considerations is really unavoidable if you're going to really appreciate what it is you're doing in life and why you're doing it. And far from this having been left behind in the 19th century, I think we're going to have to see a renaissance of this.
I was forming a question, and you actually just sort of answered it a little bit by returning to the idea of resonance. But one of the themes in what you were talking about that I've been thinking and reading about lately, and I think is really important, is whether or not we're able to understand reality, the world, evolution, as having inherent value and qualities, right? Sort of the reality of goodness, truth, and beauty. We were speaking earlier tonight about a sense of like basic goodness and the way that that's recognized. It's recognizable. And I know some people who are thinking about this, and they came up with this notion of anthro-ontology, which is we know what's real through ourself. We have to be able to, because there's a resonance between the human and reality, because the human is an expression of reality, we actually can know the truth within ourselves because we are reality.
And if we are reality, then something out there must be real too.
Exactly. So there's a way that we can understand reality by going inward, so to speak, and also there's also a way that we can understand things externally. But trying to lead towards a question, I was just wondering, I feel like that is a key thing for us moving forward when we look at the world around us and the sad state of mental health that people are in. There's a sort of background nihilism and cynicism that connects to materialism and the sort of scientism that you're talking about. All those things are sort of interwoven in a sort of postmodern deconstruction of truth and value.
Exactly.
So part of our project as parents and as educators is reconstructing a story, a true story of value, which is true and good and beautiful. So I wonder if you had to sort of bring it down to the level of parents and teachers, if maybe you could end on any thoughts you had around how do we, as parents and teachers, establish, transmit, resonate with, foster, facilitate this sense that the world in reality is good truth is real and possible to understand and access. Perhaps beauty is a doorway. And how do we cultivate this and sort of reclaim this sense that there is inherent meaning and goodness in this human life, in this human project?
Well, there's dozens of different levels, isn't there? I mean, let's just start somewhere. Developing an empathic relationship with nature. Rediscovering the miracles of the natural world, not just theoretically, but experientially. Even research papers tell us that time in nature is one of the best ways of helping a child to overcome anxiety, or for that matter, even ADHD. It helps focus, it helps attention, it helps to relax. So anything to do with cultivating an awareness of the natural world order is going to be in the right direction. But that can also mean, you can extend that into, okay, yesterday morning, I'm staying in Kimberton Hills, yesterday morning the community turned out at 9 o'clock in the morning. Do you know why? The cows were let out. Well, I went. I've only seen the cows being let out twice in my life. I think it was, the other time was at Kimberton Hills 10 years ago. You see the joy of the cow being let out. You get a sense of the succulent grass. You imagine what it is for the cow to be confronted by the smell, taste, moisture of the grass on what was a very warm morning after being cooped up in these barns, even although the conditions of the barns are probably optimal as far as barns go. Now, if a child experiences that, we would hope that the child would respond or resonate with a feel-good factor. And maybe it would even manifest 10 years later in saying, I'm going to be a farmer. And moreover, I'm going to be an organic farmer because they know how to look after the cows, because these cows are beings. And it's my job to help them to be happy because I've seen what they need in order to be happy. It's a good place to start with animals or with plants. But then you come on to humans. What does it mean? What were you saying to me on the car, Brad? How important it was to be seen. If a child feels that they are seen, something happens within the child which is so magical that even the neuroscientists know about it and can't explain it. If a child is seen, then a child gains, through being seen, a sense they exist. And the problem of mental health is that you lose your sense that you exist. Or that your existence becomes so contorted or on the rack that it's not worth it anymore. The ability to see, the quality of empathy, and the quality, and in order to do that, in the modern world, you do have to often develop something that isn't natural. You have to develop reverence, and you have to develop respect, and you have to develop qualities like devotion. Otherwise, you'll just chuck anything in the bin. So look at recycling. Is recycling just to save an environment from horrible human beings who are destroying it? No, it's not only that. Recycling is to honour the nature of the being and to honour where it's come from and reinsert it back in evolution, and by reinserting it in the best way back in evolution so that it doesn't poison everything on the way or consume more waste, we have to we have to inwardly make a choice. Do this rather than do something easy. But we won't be motivated to do that unless we've developed a reverence for what it is that we're recycling. And in modern day culture, it isn't terribly easy to develop a reverence for a tin can or a plastic bottle or whatever else we just put in the trash can. But only through developing an inner quality of reverence will we self-motivate to recycle. And if we don't self-motivate to recycle, what will happen? Well, we'll either lose all the services and just have to live in our own mess forever, or we'll be subject to a certain kind of tyranny which tells us what we can and can't do, because the human being doesn't have the capacity to make a moral judgment themselves, but for the sake of the world, whatever that is, and why the world matters, if your human being doesn't matter. And then you get into the whole evolutionary theory of, well, the human being is the curse of the world, and it would be better if the world didn't have people in it, because they are the ones that destroy, whereas all the other parts of the universe are in a good, sound eco-relationship, and they won't lead to their destruction. So we shouldn't be here at all. But interestingly enough, we are the only people, seemingly, on this globe who can know that. We're the only people that can violate the world, but we're the only people who have the possibility to actually understand what it is we should do and become a co-creator that can give birth to a different world that isn't necessarily going to be worse. But if that's the case, then you're back to the question, who is the human being within creation? Now, that's going up, and Brad wanted me to be a bit more practical. People often say, James, how do you apply all this in practice? And if I'm a bit frustrated, I say, you know what? I never apply any of it.
Well, cows
so hang on. And then I pause and wait for people to think, who is this guy? And then I say, if it's real for me, it will apply itself through me. In other words, there are certain attitudes and prerequisites and preconditions, like devotion, reverence, respect, like the ability to experience joy if you see the cows come out in the spring, or whatever, that are starting points for a sense of coherence. But these starting points have to be modelled through education, through parenting. And therefore, the only place to start is, where am I in all this? What am I doing? Because the child, it's not just Steiner that said the child is the great imitator. Everybody, everyone since Steiner in modern attachment theory has elaborated on that statement. Mirror neurons in the brain are just one commonly known example of how, through the act of imitation, we build our own faculty. So, particularly for the developing child, what is the authenticity of what is being modelled will resonate with the child, because a child has a natural ability to resonate with that which is authentic. If a child is given stuff that is either not authentic or isn't resonantly nourishing, that child will turn away from you, will turn away from the world, and will develop ADHD or whatever, it doesn't matter. So I think the answer to your question has to be, look to every aspect of your environment and yourself and say, how is my relationship to myself, my environment, and my fellow human beings conveying itself to the child, because the child is a resonance chamber. And in the act of seeing my child and how he or she is responding to what they're receiving in the environment, in the act of conveying to the child the fact that I've experienced the child will strengthen their experience of being experienced. And that's the same thing as the sense of self. Coleridge, the English poet, said, "Thou art, therefore I am." And another way of seeing that is, I need to be seen by you in order to know who I am. So the human being isn't meant to be an isolated creature. But have you heard of Ian McGilchrist? Relationship precedes individuality. Relationship between everything and everything precedes thingness. So that's a thing, or we think it's a thing, pair of spectacles. But if we look at all the substances in there, whether it's metal, silica, or what have you, this was all once a coherent body of relationship. I missed my point on geology, didn't I? I sort of aborted myself. The geology piece, I said, what would a modern geologist say about the origin of the Earth's crust? And I left it hanging. I mean, a modern geologist would say, well, all the calcium in the Earth's crust, which is only 10% or so, came from either animals, skeletons, or plankton, or coral, or things like that, yes? So they would immediately say the chalk mountains were once part of the animal kingdom, and the moment you say that, you can immediately say, and that animal kingdom was in an ecological relationship with everything else in that animal kingdom. Probably most geologists wouldn't say that the silicates of the Earth's crust, which are more like 90%, originated in organic living matter. They'd say, well, it's come up from volcanoes, and it was substance that melted down in the depths of the earth, and it was blown up and it becomes basalt or something, which is probably true, because most rocks do have an igneous origin, although not all, because the crystal formations are different. Steiner said everything to do with silica was originally a plant, just like everything to do with calcium was originally an animal. And that's one of his challenges statements, that you then have to say, let's look at the evidence for that, let's see if we can back it up. But the point being that what we have in a world of items and things wasn't always there. It was part of an ecology of the world and the universe, and the further back we go in time, the less was that material and the more did it represent a higher level of being. And the higher up we go in the level of being, so the higher level of consciousness we find. And so ultimately there's a high level of consciousness behind matter. So we have a different evolutionary theory. And the moment we say that, it's then easy to say, we are part of the world, we are made of the same matter as the world, we have calcium and silica in us. So if behind the world there was a higher level of matter, then behind us there was too, and we seem to be endowed with the capacity to wake up to that fact. And maybe there's some point in that wake up for that level of consciousness. So maybe we are part of a higher evolution of consciousness, of being. I think that's the hypothesis.
Today was Cow Day here at the farm across the street, and our whole school, kindergarten through 12th grade, went to see the cows. It was the perfect start to a beautiful day, and this was the perfect end to a beautiful day. So thank you very much.
Great.
I actually would like to take a shot at a question. Can I do that still, or are we too late?
I guess so. It is getting late, but sure. If you're up for it.
Yeah.
Are you up for one more? Okay.
So thanks for the talk. I thought that it was, it brought me back to my time as a philosophy of science PhD student. But I wonder, do you think that one of the differences is between that and this is that I wonder whether you wanted it to be a kind of philosophical argument, or whether you wanted it to be more like almost artistic performance, in the sense that you're wanting the audience to feel a certain way. The reason I say that is that you ricochet off obviously you know this, you're ricocheting off so many huge problems in philosophy very quickly, and then giving a view on it. But I know that you're aware of all the answers to those kind of questions, like the second law of thermodynamics and evolution. Like the general way that people that evolutionaries
Good night.
talk about that is not that it's a conflict at all, that life is very, very good at increasing entropy. That's what it does better than almost anything else. So I'm wondering if you have like a argument in this, like one large argument that someone could say, I disagree with that in particular, or whether you don't think it's that that's very important, and that that more you're trying to give a sense of a feeling that people can take with them.
I'm sure it's far more the latter than the former. Start awakening to some fundamental issues yourself. I'm certainly not trying to give, fixes, but simply opening up the field and showing that the more you open up any stone you lift up, you'll find far more there than you expect, and however much you go into it, you'll find more questions than answers. And that's the nature of things. I think I can think philosophically, but I'm a very amateurish philosopher because it's not my field. I think I've probably got a pretty decent grasp of the basics of medicine. And probably I could deal with a lot of things that's going on in modern medicine now and speak about them with a measure of authority. I don't know an awful lot of things that you probably know in terms of the details, like what you've just now said. I mean, someone like Ian McGilchrist is so into his, I don't know what you'd call it, cognitive scientific philosophy, that he seems to have gone down almost every single rabbit hole that there is, and can unpack anything from any point and mould it in such a way that it points to his conclusions. But as far as I can see, his conclusions are very simple. Matter and consciousness are not distinct, and things come from relationship. And there almost certainly is a supersensible existence, but how the human being in our ordinary consciousness can relate to that, I think he leaves open. And I think where I'm coming from is that Steiner did his take on that, but he went a bit further. He didn't just stay at the philosophical level, but he said, and I'm going to go further. And having gone further, he created what he called spiritual science, which he said you can't prove, but which he said anyone with sound reason can get a sense for the truth of, or it's not beyond people. And I suppose I've been a bit of an applied anthroposopher in my life, who's studied philosophy to the point that I felt I need to personally, but in terms of studying philosophy, it's fairly primitive. But I think I can understand, if I'm exposed to people doing philosophical arguments, I can usually follow them, because there are certain premises that all philosophers are confounded by, and they all end up having to do with how is what's inside related to what's outside, what is cognition, can you know truth, is there such a thing as knowing truth, and whether it's Wittgenstein or Merleau-Ponty or some of them, thousands of names I don't know, they're all wrestling in the same ground, and subsequent generations of philosophers are covering the same ground that other people covered. And many philosophers say it was all there in Aristotle and Plato anyway, and we've just got more sophisticated versions now. So I haven't made that my particular thing. Someone called Spencer Clavin has. He's a youngster who does podcasts, and he's prominent on the internet. And he's a sort of Ian McGilchrist type person, but he's more of a philosopher. And he's discovered an interest in Steiner, which is kind of nice, because Steiner tends to be Steiner tends to be ignored.
I didn't know about him until here.
He is systematically, Ian McGilchrist's references are like that. I don't know how many thousands they go into. He's even referenced an obscure philosopher to whom Steiner dedicated his main philosophical work, but he doesn't reference Steiner. He's referenced Goethe, but Goethe was the first person, Steiner was the first person to edit and bring into the public domain Goethe's scientific work in 7 volumes. But Steiner doesn't get referenced. And Ian McGilchrist knows all about Steiner because people who know about Steiner have been very curious, because he seems to come to the same, generally, direction. And they've asked him, and he knows about it, but he just says, well, I can't do everything, and I don't know everything. Fair enough, but surely you could reference him. Surely he's due one tiny little reference. But maybe it's because to do so is to bring bad repute upon yourself. Maybe it's because people think if you reference Steiner, you're signed up to a sect. Because nobody other than Steiner has really proposed that there could be such a thing as spiritual science. There may be religion, and there may be a supersensible world, but McGilchrist doesn't claim that we can know anything about it. Now, how is that with Ken Wilber?
How is what, the integration of Steiner?
No, I think Ken Wilber knows about Steiner. I don't think there's any doubt. How does he look at what it takes to awaken at the different levels of consciousness that he enumerates?
Yeah, sort of what I was speaking to, the term anthro-ontology is sort of a really general take on that includes many forms of meditation. Wilber was influenced more by Eastern religions, Vedanta and Vajrayanas and Buddhism mostly. So, more looking at the meditative path, and I think it's a separate conversation, but I think that's where some people get lost in Steiner, is that there are many lineages that have practices of meditation that do cultivate awareness and lead to some sort of evolution of consciousness and the transformation of state stages.
Absolutely.
But the way that Steiner approaches it is different, and it doesn't really. I think in some ways it's more confusing for people. How you get from A to B, how you get to those conclusions, is less clear. Whereas in many lineages, there's actually a very well laid out and well articulated path. So my sense is that is just one of the many reasons why people tend to not include him in their sources, because there's just less clarity about how do you get from where you're at now to where he's ended up. Whereas if you're talking to a priest or a Tibetan Lama or something, that's actually built into their whole lineages, is teaching you how to get from where you're at to where they are.
And I'm with all that, and the, for want of a better word, the content of what Steiner downloaded, translated or transcribed from higher dimensions of consciousness, has a very different character than anything else I know of that's ever been downloaded. For one thing, he takes on ordinary concepts which belong to a lower level of consciousness and tries to use them in such a way that they can resonate with realities that can never be reduced to that level of conceptual reality, but he tries to make those realities, he tries to make the realm of concepts resonate with a higher reality. And that's made, I won't say it's made him many enemies, but it's many people have just said, "Hi Steiner, you can't do that. You have created an intellectualization of something that is so supremely non-intellectual that you're violating something." And I understand people saying that, but the fact is that if he hadn't done that, there would be no Waldorf education, no biodynamic farming, no anthroposophic medicine, no eurythmy, no goodness knows what else, because he managed to bring realities that he discovered on higher levels down into terms which can help to create schools that more or less ordinary people can run. And you don't find that in other religious traditions generally, except in the traditions associated with them. You will find it in their accompanying traditions, but the actual meditative practices don't generate new things to happen in this world. And someone once said to Steiner, this is anecdotal, I don't know it's true, but I've been told this by someone who knew Steiner, that someone once said to him, Dr. Steiner, are you the greatest initiate of all time? And he said, no, but I'm the only one that's learnt to think.